Welcome everybody to our fourth and final session for today. Our focus has been on rebuilding the fashion industry with a focus on social. I am Kelly Drennan. For those of you who I don't know, I'm the founder of Fashion Takes Action. We are a nonprofit organization based in Toronto, Canada, and are the producers of the World Ethical Apparel Roundtable or WEAR conference. We normally would have this would have been our 7th year hosting the conference in person, but of course with COVID, we've had to offer this now in digital format. So thank you. I know some of you joining this session have been with us throughout the day. Thank you again for giving us your time, for listening and for learning. So while we're waiting for more participants to come in, feel free to tell us where you're coming from in the chat function. I know many of you have used this function already today. We've had quite a global audience. Great to see Calgary, okay, and Halifax, wonderful. I'm also going to just issue a quick poll so that we have a sense of what role or who you are more specifically. So if you can just take a second to quickly answer this poll, that would be wonderful. And if for whatever reason you have to leave early, this is being recorded and we will be sharing it with you. Also, if you haven't registered for any of our sessions tomorrow, we will have more of a focus on the environment and the economy as it relates to COVID, looking at science-based targets, carbon, water, forests, as well as looking at business recovery strategies and how to keep sustainability a priority looking to the future. So please do feel free to register for those. They are free. I will share the link in the chat. Speaking of the chat, if you do have questions for our speaker today, then please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And let's just keep the chat function open for commentary, if you have anything that you would like to share, links, things like that. We also have the upvote function on the questions. So if somebody poses a question and you also wanted to ask that question, then you can just simply like it and it'll be pushed up to the top. And we will have some time at the end of the presentation to have your questions answered. Okay, so we still have people coming in, but for the sake of time, and I know the last session we got started late, so I'm trying to be as punctual as possible with this. So if you've been with us today, you know that we've had some really great conversations on traceability, on transparency, on worker rights, worker voice, and now we're going to get into what it takes, the necessary steps to build a more harmonious supply chain. We basically know that there needs to be a better way. You know, we've been sort of stuck in this old way of doing business, and Avedis from RAP, the Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production, is here to shed some insight in this very informative presentation. So welcome. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the next hour or so. I'm going to turn off my video and let you take it over, and I'll be joining at the end. Okay?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here. I have a little presentation that I can set up here for us to utilize as part of our discussion. Let's see. Hopefully you're all seeing the cover page right now, and Kelly, I'll trust you to speak up if that's not what's happening, but I think we've got this right. So thank you again, Kelly, and to, everybody who's stayed through or joined for this particular session. I know it's been a long day, and I'm happy to be part of this very interesting conversation. As Kelly mentioned, lots of good topics have been covered: transparency, traceability, the whole idea of putting people first. That was the first session. That all will tie into some of the things I have to say. And I know we've got a pretty diverse audience from the poll, so it should make for some fascinating conversation at the end of it, and I intend to save a bunch of time for that, so I look forward to it. So what am I addressing here? I'm talking about building a more harmonious supply chain. As you know, those of you who've been on the seminar from the morning or have just joined, the theme here is to build back better, right? As Kelly mentioned, we're aware more so than we were, 7-8 months ago, of some of the failings of the old way of doing things. COVID has exposed them for what they were, and in the spirit of not wasting an opportunity, even if it comes in the form of a crisis, we do want to take advantage of that and come to a new way of doing things better. And various panelists have talked about this in the context of various elements, how to better engage workers and their voice in the future, how to handle transparency, traceability in the future. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to manage social compliance in the supply chain in a better way in the post-COVID world. And the way we propose at RAP for that to happen is this new concept called synchronization. So this presentation is about harmonious supply chains and an introduction to this idea of synchronization. It's a made-up word, and I'll tell you a little bit about the history and the sort of thinking behind it. But I thought I would begin by sharing with you what my presentation plan is for the next 25 to 30 minutes. As indicated, I am the president and CEO of RAP, Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production. For those of you not familiar with RAP, I wanted to give a very brief overview of the organization so you can put my remarks into their right context. And then I will introduce this idea of synchronization. And in telling the story of synchronization, I'm going to follow a very simple, what was then and what is now and what is to come sort of plan. We'll talk about the old way of doing things and what the fundamental flaws therein were, discuss what the new way of doing things ought to be in the post-pandemic world, and then of course ask the question of how will we get there? What is it that we need to do between now and then to complete that transition? And I will, as promised, save time for questions and answers at the end, and I always look forward to that part the most. And as I said, given the diverse audience we have today, given what I've seen of the questions asked of previous panelists, that's the part I am most excited about and will be looking forward to. Okay, so RAP, Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production. Who are we? Well, we are the world's largest independent factory-based certification program that is focused on this industry, the apparel, footwear, sewn products, writ large industry. There are many organizations, well, not many, several organizations in our peer space that focus on supply chain social compliance management, but we're the only ones that are dedicated to this industry. We don't certify factories in pharmaceutical or food or other industries. We are focused on this industry, and in that capacity are the largest independent factory-based certification program. Our scope from an industry point of view may be limited to the sewn product sector, but our geographic scope is not. The W in our name stands for worldwide. We inspect and certify factories all over the world. We typically describe ourselves in this sort of fashion. We are an objective, nonprofit team of global social compliance experts. That's who we are. What we do is promote safe, lawful, humane, and ethical manufacturing around the world. That's our mission. That's kind of what we do. And how we do it is through certification. That's the primary mechanism. We inspect factories and validate that they are meeting our standards and certify that fact for those factories to be able to then have an independent basis to make that claim to their buyers. And through education. We consider education to be mission-centric for our organization. And so we're always grateful for opportunities like this one where we get to speak to audiences around the world and talk about these issues and spread the gospel of compliance, such as it were. Philosophically, we believe very much in engaging with industry. We are an NGO in that sense, but not a typical activist organization. There is a role for them to play, of course, but our approach has from the beginning been to see the industry as a place that you can engage with, and if you do so successfully, you're much better positioned to drive change, because that's really where the potential for improvement and sort of the driving forces, the decisions that will actually impact behavior, whether it's buyer behavior or through that manufacturer behavior or otherwise. So our philosophy has been to engage with industry and position ourselves as a program of choice for industry associations, whether we're talking about manufacturers associations or brand associations. And we've found that that works and really is able to help us move the needle much more so than another approach might. And so in Canada, we're good friends with and have done a lot of good work with Bob Kirk and the Canadian Apparel Federation. And here in the United States, where we're headquartered, we are the official CSR partner for the American Apparel and Footwear Association, the AAFA. So we believe in working with industry to drive the change that needs to be seen and needs to happen to improve working conditions and improve supply chain social compliance management. Right. So introducing now this idea of synchronization and sort of what drove us to it. We published a white paper on this in June, something I believe Kelly may have shared. There will be a link to it at the end of the presentation for those of you who might be interested. Really, fundamentally, it comes down to the realization that this pandemic presents an opportunity. In the crisis that we're all suffering from, there is this opportunity to reset, right? To rethink the supply chain social compliance management paradigm, right? And that resetting involves moving away from the old way of doing things, the duplicative proprietary programs that each brand and retailer insisted on having audits done against for each factory that they work with, to an approach that really involves a handful of specialized, professional, independent organizations providing a menu of options approach for the supply chain as a whole. Right? This is the sort of overview of the idea. I'll break it down into its components in a second, but it is fundamentally a rethinking. And you've heard this theme echoed in previous panels, right? We need a fundamental structural change to the fashion industry when it comes to, for example, on the first panel, how purchasing practices are executed. This is in that vein, a fundamental structural change to the thinking, to the way supply chain social compliance management has been approached. And the new paradigm is this menu of options, independent programs rather than duplicative proprietary programs. And the other element of this change is to really see it from a supply chain as a whole perspective, which, as I said, I will expound upon as we continue with our presentation. So how do we come to this place? You know, the old way of doing things, we need to understand that and sort of drill down to some of those fundamental flaws to really get to why this new paradigm is needed and how it will improve upon the old way of doing things. A theme again that was echoed on previous panels, notably that very first one, the putting people first in fashion supply chains panel, social compliance, which, as those of you who have been observers of the industry for a while know, is a relatively new concept, right? You probably would be hard pressed to say it's older than 25, 30 years at the most. If you went back to the mid to late 80s even and asked a factory for a social compliance certificate, you'd get a blank stare because the concept did not exist. It's a relatively new idea, but it got off on the wrong foot. It was not set up appropriately because what was at the root of its genesis was in the mid to late 1990s, a lot of exposés, hidden camera work and the like that showed the world that there are some horrific sweatshops out there manufacturing product for well-known brands and retailers in a name and shame type approach that truly took the industry by storm and by shock, and resulted in the need for the industry to move very quickly and react from a point of defensiveness, right? So from the very beginning, buyers and manufacturers from that sort of genesis point were cast in opposing roles. They saw each other through an adversarial lens. And that was unfortunate. It was, as I said, the function of the reality in which this genesis took place. But unfortunately, it meant that you've got this starting position that pits one side of the supply chain as being against the other. And the concept was that responsible sourcing rules were made by the buyers and were imposed upon the manufacturers. It was sort of essentially a one-way street, the focus being from the buyers, from, call it the global West, to the manufacturers in the global South. And that's not ideal from our point of view, and we can see why that can be a challenge, but that was the reality. That's how we began in the mid to late 1990s into the early 2000s. And again, because things were moving so quickly, because there was such reputational capital at stake, the evolution ended up with brands and retailers developing a whole bunch of proprietary social compliance programs. There was a sudden burst of all these codes of conduct, proprietary programs, a cornucopia of codes, and of course the codes out there had to then be checked against, and so all these proprietary audit programs and internal audit schemes came up, which, when you look at them in action, one didn't think of this at the time, obviously, but inevitably the result was audit fatigue. Your typical factory is going to have multiple buyers as clients, and so if you have 12, 13 clients you're working with, then you're subjecting yourself to 12 or 13 audits a year in order to keep doing business with them. And really, this was not the intention, but that was the consequence. And by the mid 2000s, it became quite clear that this audit fatigue was real and detrimental to supply chain harmony, and not conducive really to achieving the goals that you were trying to achieve with the programs in the first place. So we started to see in the mid O's or 2000s, I still don't know what we're supposed to call that decade. I don't think a particular term has emerged, but whatever the 2000s you want to call them, there were attempts made at harmonizing this approach. We realize audit fatigue is real. We want to do something about it. Let's come up with these harmonization attempts. And the attempts, if you look at the history of the attempts, there were two phases or two flavors, perhaps, might be another way of putting it. In the early part, the first set of attempts was really focused on the idea of a universal code. Can we come up with a single set of values that everyone will accept, make that be what is checked against, and so everyone just does the checking once because we're all asking the same universal values, checking for those in the manufacturing facilities. All those attempts failed, and I had long since been saying that such attempts were always going to be doomed to fail, because really, even if you acknowledge and understand the reality that 90+% of these codes are the same, the fact is that that part that isn't the same, the 5 or 10% or whatever the math is on that, is different because it comes from reflecting values that are specific to that buyer or brand, that they consider part of their ethos, part of their unique selling proposition, part of their DNA within their organization. And you might well be able to agree on technical stuff and sort of non-value specific issues, but you're never going to come to agreement on universally on values. And so those attempts were always going to fail because the 5% could not be given up, even in favor of the 95%. And so the harmonization attempts space itself evolved and said, okay, we get it. We cannot come to agreement on universal values. Can we come up maybe with a universal process? Can we create some kind of equivalency or benchmarking? Because we might not have the same values, but we can ask the same questions the same way and then impose our own values on top of that. And that's a much more refined and much more logical way to approach it. But even all those attempts have failed. And again, I would submit they're doomed to fail because fundamentally they made the same mistake. They are trying to impose a single size solution onto the space. And this industry, more than any other, understands that one size does not fit all. Right? Heck, we haven't even solved the sizing problem in the apparel industry. So as a proposition that there's only going to be one way to do it, it just isn't a viable concept. The old adage about there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? Or if you want to put it in apparel terms, there's more than one way to knit a sweater, is true. And so trying to impose a single size solution, trying to say to folks, let's just all do it this one way, simply does not work. It is not a viable option. So all of that has happened as a consequence of these harmonization attempts, is that the very term harmonization has become a loaded one. And it carries a lot of negative baggage. And so the question becomes, if we are asking ourselves, what is the new way of doing things? How can we address those fundamental flaws, the setting off of responsible sourcing as a concept, on supply chain compliance as a concept on the wrong foot, the adversarial footage, the baggage that comes with the term harmonization, and this whole failure to understand that one size does not fit all. How can we overcome these things and have a new way of doing things? And that's what we are proposing at RAP in the form of synchronization. It starts with understanding that responsible sourcing is a supply chain issue, right? It's not one end of the supply chain versus the other. It is a whole of the supply chain issue, right? And that fundamentally means that all parties have responsibilities that they have to follow. Right? And again, one other point to emphasize, all parties here isn't simply lumping buyers and manufacturers together and saying they're both responsible. There's more at stake here. The supply chain is typically seen as the chain that connects manufacturers to buyers and then on to consumers. But so much else happens around that, the context of that chain, the wire going over the chain, NGOs, governments, workers, obviously, as a key foundation for all this. So everyone has a role and a responsibility. And so you have to see it holistically in order to best harmonize the practices that will make for a more sustainable, more resilient supply chain. Transparency has been a topic discussed in a previous panel, and traceability as a part of that. These are central to this. Collaboration that is only made possible when you have that trust that you need that transparency for, are all going to be central as elements to ensuring that you are able to overcome the false foundations upon which some of these practices were first established. And that really brings us then to synchronization. What we are offering is a new thought set, a new paradigm that is at its heart aimed at harmonizing supply chains, because harmony as a goal is a laudable one, is a good one. We want that. But harmonization as a term has become a negative one. So we wanted to come up with a new term for it. And the visual we thought of that complements the core of synchronization, which is this menu of options approach to replace proprietary programs, is that of a symphony. A symphony involves all kinds of instruments. They don't all sound the same. They're not all played the same way, but together they make beautiful music. Right? So we took that visual and said, that's what we're saying. We're not trying to come up with a single instrument playing just one note over and over again. That doesn't work. We want multiple instruments, but we want them to play in concert. And so this philosophy we are terming synchronization as this new approach, where we want a menu of options approach that will replace proprietary programs with the immediate and obvious benefit of reducing audit fatigue. That's a key goal here and a key consequence. And it is fundamentally based on the idea that you're not going to impose a one-size-fits-all solution anymore. No more, let's just do it one way, because as I said, one size does not fit all. We want to be able to allow each player in this space to move at their own pace. Some brands are much further along on supply chain social compliance management issues. Others are still early in the learning curve, and many in between. So you want to be able to come up with an approach that can accommodate this wide range of players, instead of insisting on only one approach that might work for the extreme sort of leading edge thought leaders, but not for the ones first entering into the arena. So you want to allow for folks to move on their own pace and not insist on a one size fits all. The other element of this is that the proprietary programs suffer really from a credibility question, right? Brands and retailers inspecting their own supply chains, there is clearly an important due diligence function that they have to do, but they themselves doing it is a questionable practice. Again, it's something that's come up in some of the previous panels with regards to just how enforceable something like that is, how credible it is, as I've already said. There are instead independent credible programs that already exist. That's what RAP does, and we're not the only ones that do it, right? The point is we can do the due diligence function that brands are taking on upon themselves much more efficiently and much more credibly, and thereby, and in doing so, reduce audit fatigue as well, all of which are good and are bolstering harmony in the supply chain. And harmonization attempts also all failed because they didn't involve these programs, these credible programs, as effectively as they ought to. And our invitation in the synchronization paper is expressly to our peers in this space to have collaboration amongst us to further improve the model by making sure that we do not duplicate, expertise or geographies or the like, and essentially end up not practicing what we're preaching here. So this idea of efficiency as the lodestone for a more harmonious supply chain in the future is what's at the core of synchronization. And it becomes even more important of an issue as we realize that social compliance is now penetrating deeper into the supply chain. It's no longer simply just a first tier activity. It's complex enough at that level, but once you start going further to the mills, to the dye houses, to the cotton, it becomes much more important that you do so efficiently. And again, that's at the heart of synchronization as a concept. So how will we get there? Right? This is where the whole take advantage of the crisis point I've made earlier comes up. We are in a crisis. There's no two ways about it. But there are generally silver linings even to the darkest of clouds. And one thing that we've already seen as a result of COVID has been that buyers have already been forced to be more flexible when it comes to executing these due diligence functions. They've had to still continue doing that, but they haven't been able to do it in their own way of using their own proprietary programs because their own people could not get into the factory. So they've had to ask themselves, well, what's the alternative? Can we see, oh, wait a minute, this factory is showing us a RAP certificate, or this factory actually was visited by another organization right before COVID. Maybe we use that. And they have seen in doing so that it's viable. It gets them what they need. It is a due diligence function at the end of the day that is being done credibly by these independent bodies, and they can simply leverage that, and that works. That's how we get there, by recognizing that reality, albeit a COVID-imposed recognition, but nonetheless, take it for what it's worth. And recognize from it that these various key themes emerge that I've touched upon in various points of the previous slides, starting with the point about this being a supply chain issue, right? It's not just a problem at one end of it, right? We've heard from previous panelists about some of the challenges, and then we know the old adage about a chain only being as strong as its weakest link. So things like purchasing practices and the role that plays when it comes to influencing a factory's ability to engage in the kind of responsible behaviors you want has been raised in previous panels and is very much a part of the synchronization conversation. We've also already touched upon this, and we've had a panel about transparency. It is going to be not only valuable, but essential for there to be greater transparency and greater collaboration, because again, this is a much more holistic approach to the question of supply chain harmony. And you have to be cognizant of that going in, understanding the importance of that. In the end, it is a question of looking at this crisis and realizing that, my goodness, one thing that we have learned is how interconnected we are, right? We've heard about how, in the beginning, it felt more as a supply shock, right? Factories were closed in China and you weren't able to get goods to the West. And then it eventually became a demand shock, which is where we are right now. either way you look at it, it's a demonstration of how interconnected the supply chain is. You're not going to be able to achieve your goals, whichever end of the supply chain you're on, whether you're the buyer or the manufacturer or anywhere in between or the consumer, without it all working together. Right? So this crisis has shown that we need to ensure much more robust, much more flexible, ultimately much more resilient supply chains. And that's what synchronization is about. That is fundamentally what the precept here is. And it really boils down truly to sustainability. If we are not going to be able to sustain the way we do business, and we are not if we stick to the old way or attempt to return to the old way, then we are in the long run dooming ourselves to failure. Because, and you heard this from Hendrik Alpen of H&M in that first panel, and echoed by, in a different context, Mostafiz Uddin from Denim Experts, both sides need each other. The brand can't come back after this crisis and be successful if they have killed off their suppliers in between because of their behavior, right? And at the same time, the factory is not going to be able to sustain itself if the brands are not able to meet the demands and the realities that they're facing. So it is truly a chain, all interlinked, and you have to treat it in that light to best get the harmony that you need to be efficient, to be robust and flexible, ultimately to remain sustainable. So to conclude then, this pandemic has really been a tragedy in any way you slice it, and truly a crisis. But one thing it has done that is perhaps good for the future is shown us that using proprietary audit programs, the old way of doing things, duplicative supply chain social compliance management approach, is really a luxury that we can no longer afford. Right? And that's truly what it is. I understand the attraction that a proprietary program poses, has for a brand or retailer. The control is attractive. I get that. But maybe back then, back in the day when we had the ability to be, I don't want to say wasteful, but to be more open with our how we use our resources, maybe it was a luxury we could afford, right? But now it is not. COVID has shown that for a fact. And really, when you think about what we're proposing, which is something the brands have learned themselves, right? Being forced to look at other options because of COVID that go beyond their own program, has shown buyers that this is a viable approach. And when we're asking for that shift to become permanent, what we're saying isn't that we are compelling you to give up control. Instead, the better way to think about it is we're reallocating resources away from a pre-competitive due diligence function, which is important and you have to do, but is better done in a credible way using independent programs, to more consumer-facing competitive elements that will differentiate your brand in the marketplace in ways that actually help your business, right? That's the way to really think about it. And that's the point of synchronization. It is now time to make this approach, this menu of options approach, where you no longer insist on your own program, but say any one of these independent, credible ones will suffice, a permanent fixture, a new way of thinking, the new paradigm for supply chain social compliance management. And that is what we call synchronization. As promised, there is the link to the complete paper. It'll be there when this information is shared with everyone. Thank you for your attention. I'll leave my contact info up here for a second, but I am really looking forward, and I'm saving the bulk of the time here for question and answers. And I will stop sharing the screen now and hand it back over to you, Kelly.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Avidus. That was very informative and a really great way to sort of bring everything that we have discussed today together. Yeah, it's synchronization. I was wondering if you made that up, but I love it though. It's like this this beautiful way of bringing together, collaboration and harmony, and I think it's going to catch on. Maybe it's the new sustainability buzzword. So thank you for that. We do have a couple of questions here, but I just was curious to know. Let me just see here. Yeah, I was wondering, like, if you could just give for the brands or retailers that are on this session, maybe some concrete next steps as they sort of move from the old way of doing business into this idea of synchronization?
Sure, it's a great question, and I think an important one. I focus mostly on the paradigm and the theory, but really, what does it mean in practice? Well, I mentioned a couple of things, right? The immediate ask is, stop insisting on your own proprietary program. It is not helping, and it really isn't necessary, right? So to make that move, any self-respecting brand really ought to start by making a thoughtful sort of assessment of what they're doing, what they want to come out of their program, and look at the peers in the space, and then obviously RAP will be happy to answer any questions that you might have in that regard, and test these programs. Nobody's asking you to take on a new partner, an independent program just on faith. Go ahead and do your due diligence as you would with any new partner, right? Test your scheme against the credible programs out there. See if you're noticing anything terribly different. I doubt you will. And look at the cost implications, right? Your own program does have that attractiveness of control, but it is an overhead. As I said, think of those resources you could then reallocate to competitive functions if you get a true understanding of what those costs are that you're imposing, not only on yourself, but on your program. And those savings can be put to much better use. And when you get to that conclusion, I would, again, to borrow from the musical sort of lexicon, sing it out loud. Don't be a quiet person on the side saying, I'm not going to tell the world that this is the move I'm making. We've seen, and the word is new, Kelly, synchronization, but the idea isn't necessarily brand spanking new. There have been players in this space who have taken this approach for a while now. Disney has been doing really what is synchronization for the longest time as the core part of their ILS program. Walmart, the world's biggest retailer, a couple of years ago moved to effectively what is synchronization by saying we're not going to do our proprietary RS, responsible sourcing program anymore. Instead, we'll accept any certificate from one of these guys, RAP included. So there is practical evidence out there. In both cases, they make it known to the world. It's important that you do that so that your buyers, your clients, your factories all understand that this is the approach you're taking, and that is sort of a couple of very concrete things that you can do as a buyer and make things better for yourself and for your suppliers.
Wonderful. There's a question that it's got a little popularity going here. It's related to startups. So with limited resources and usually, sourcing from manufacturers that quote the lowest prices, how can startups move towards this new model of business?
So in many ways, synchronization ought to come naturally to a startup in the sense that it is the most efficient solution for them out there, right? Startups, by definition, begin with much limited resources, and this due diligence function, is absolutely important because you want to do it right. And so if you are just getting started, you're in a much better place than someone who's had their own program for a while and now must decide how to transition. You can actually jump right in and not even begin, not even set up your own proprietary program, and instead say, all right, here's who Walmart uses, and maybe leverage the fact that they've done due diligence on these organizations and established them as credible organizations, and make that be your approach from the get-go, a much more leaner, more efficient way of doing things. And the other beauty of synchronization, again, as I said, is we're not trying to impose even a specific list of programs on anyone. If you are an absolute startup, you're just getting into this space, and you really want to lay the foundation right, then you might say to yourself, at this point in time, all I can do, given the resources I have, is look at my first tier. So fine, then your orchestra is more like a chamber orchestra, a much more limited number of players you need to make sure that that first tier basic social compliance due diligence is what's being looked at. As you evolve more and you say, all right, now I've got this embraced effectively, I want to now maybe focus more on the environment as well on this first tier. Or I want to start looking at my mills. as the next tier. Then you can add to the orchestra, right? That's the beauty of this approach. It is not one that imposes any kind of stricture in terms of you must do things this way. It just tells you, here's what needs to be done. And here's a bunch of things that can help you do it. Make your menu of options and proceed in a way that will be more efficient and more harmonious as a result.
Right. And not to be scared into thinking that you have to do this all overnight, all in one shot, Exactly.
Yeah. That's one of the big problems with the old harmonization attempts that failed, was they built these edifices that were well-intentioned, no doubt, and in some sense beautiful, but absolutely daunting for folks that are new to this, right? You gotta allow for the fact that different people are at different places in their social compliance journey, and nobody is necessarily right or wrong. It's just a relative thing. Some are further along, but that doesn't mean that they're better than the ones behind or more nobler. You have to allow for that reality, and that's the beauty of synchronization.
Great. Okay, another question here. Has RAP convinced a major brand retailer, I guess, in the fashion space, because that's where you specialize, to drop their proprietary compliance program permanently in favor of synchronization? And was the cost savings an effective part of the argument?
Sure. I don't want to take all the credit for it, but the example I gave of Walmart is a very recent and very direct answer to this question, and you can't get bigger in the retail space than Walmart. And they made the decision, and we were part of the conversation with them. I mean, obviously, they wanted to make sure that they were doing it right and doing right by their own standards and their own suppliers. And so, we spent a couple of days down in Bentonville, and as did other programs. As I said, I don't want to take all the credit myself for it, but that conversation has been had, and the results are there for all to see. I can give you other individual brand examples. Apropos to the previous question, we have generally been approached, by several smaller brands who have said, what, we're not going to be able to justify the overhead that comes with setting up our own programs. Can RAP essentially be our program? Of course, we're happy to do that. My general stance has always been, as a brand, this is going to sound almost sort of counterintuitive, but I do not encourage a brand to abdicate their responsibility completely and say, oh, we're not going to do anything, we're just going to rely on RAP or rely on someone else. I don't think that's right. In the end, you are responsible. I would say the right thing to do it would be to have your approach be, think of, again, from a symphony perspective, you're the conductor. You're not playing the instruments. You let the credible people do the actual work, but you're responsible for making sure that your suppliers are doing it right, and you're picking the right partners. So in that sense, our advice always is to these brands and retailers, we're happy to partner with you. It's very important, however, that you remain engaged and not simply say, well, since RAP's doing it, we don't have to do anything at all. Right? We're saying don't be duplicative and don't repeat stuff, but you are still ultimately the brand in question, and you are responsible. So it's a partnership. Again, think of it holistically, as I said.
Okay, next question here is, knowing that, with this varying audit strategy through synchronization, how do you ensure that your accreditation remains consistent between factories? So the consistency, moving away from a one-size-fits-all model.
I see. I wasn't sure whether that question was directed more towards sort of RAP's mechanics and how do we make sure that we are consistently certifying across factories, or whether it was directed to a buyer looking at various menu options and comparing them to each other.
Debbie, did you want to clarify that? Let's just see if she's...
Maybe I answer both very briefly, so that either way, I think, and they do relate to each other. I think the point here is there are several folks that do what we do. There aren't that many. I think a look at the market will bring the cream of the crop already up there. But it is a credibility thing. And so you have to ask yourself that exact question. How are these programs ensuring consistency across their deliverable? And is that level high enough for our needs? So it's very possible for a scheme out there to consistently deliver bad results, right? The consistency part is being maintained. So, but that's not what you want. You want consistency and you want the high level of results. And so for RAP, it really is a question of the back office functions, the quality assurance that goes into the training and the managing and the validation and the auditing of the auditors. We recognize that an audit is only as strong as the auditor on that day, on that location. So we have to make sure that our partners, whoever we work with, the monitoring firms of the world, are set up to ensure adequate internal management systems, to have guardrails for their own staff, but we ourselves are the checker of the checkers, so to speak. We insist on these partners not only proving to us that they have the systems, but individual auditors that are housed in these organizations that go do audits have to themselves be directly trained by us. And then we make sure that they are retrained every other year to keep that accreditation. And as a fundamental building block, I don't know if we've had the institution brought up in conversations before, but there is a body called APSCA, the Association of Professional Social Compliance Auditors, that really serves as the governing body for the profession, the same way a bar association serves for lawyers or a medical board serves for doctors. So we insist on membership with that body. And then with our own internal auditors, we do a lot of post-certification assessments. Factories have been certified, they're in good shape, but we go to check them again, not just to check that they continue to be in good shape, but that the auditors did the work right the first time. So there's additional layers to quality control, but these are the kind of things you need to be looking for. And I see Debbie has in the chat box clarified her question, and it was from the buyer standpoint. How do I know if a factory A and B both meet the highest standards if they both claim to be RAP certified? Are buyers involved in selecting the audit criteria? Well, the buyers are involved in the sense that you decide who gets to be on your menu of options. Right? And so if you believe certain standards are not up to your expectations, then by all means, don't use them, right? So you have that control as a buyer. As to how you look at factories, I think if you understand that a RAP certificate, for example, is really the validation that they meet the minimum requirements, then what you're saying is if you're RAP certified, that you are, the 12 principles that RAP has, I didn't go into details of those, are being met. You cannot get a RAP certificate if you fall short on any one of them, right? So what you're saying, here's a good parallel, right? Driver's licenses. That's what a certificate is. A certified factory basically is the equivalent of a person with a driver's license. What that driver's license tells you is that an independent authority has tested and validated that this individual knows how to operate a motor vehicle. That's it. Right? It doesn't tell you how good a driver he or she is. Right? It doesn't tell you whether this person is just a Sunday driver or ready for Formula One. Right? It just tells you that they know how to drive a car. That's the due diligence function. Right? We're not speaking to the quality of the product. We're not speaking to the quality of their customer service. We're speaking to their working conditions. So a factory that is RAP certified is going to meet those, and that's factory A, that's factory B, that's factory C. A might be better than B in terms of a prospective vendor for you, specific brand, but the RAP certificate puts them at an equivalency when it comes to that minimum conditions that they've met. They know how to drive a car, is the parallel.
Okay. Lots of parallels.
I like parallels.
Twitter, skinning a cat. Okay, so Aaron wants to know, how does this philosophy of synchronization balance the robust and trusted standards with practicality, cost, and accessibility?
Aaron, I think that's a great question. In fact, I think you are articulating essentially the thought behind this philosophy. I mean, the whole point is to do just that, to balance the need for supply chains to be safe, healthy, humane, and ethical, with the reality that if doing so involves 12 audits at a factory, that's not very efficient. The costs that entails, the accessibility questions that raises are just not viable. So isn't it that much better instead of having each branded retailer kind of do their own check and at their own expense and impose additional costs on the supply chain, to say, here's a bunch of credible organizations that have already done that. And if this factory is showing to you a RAP certificate, don't add additional costs to the system. You are getting a robust, trusted, independent validation of working conditions. Why are you taking the impractical step of imposing additional costs and accessibility? And I would say the opposite, right? I mean, I would love for all factories to go out there and get RAP certified. But if your factory is already certified by one of our peer organizations that does a credible job, then it's not right to insist on a RAP audit being done there on top of that, right? Just as the other way would not be fair either. If there is a RAP audit, take that. Don't be impractical and cost imposing by adding another audit on top of that.
Okay, and this last question from Vera, from Lula Vera, also kind of ties in with one of my questions was, so, you know, in terms of directly related to COVID, how has RAP adjusted your audits and accreditation process, given the limited travel, and also just looking to the future and how RAP's plan, what's RAP's plan to evolve?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question, Vera. Thank you. So, like all our peers, we were in a place, especially in the second quarter of this year, where we couldn't do the core function that we are tied to, that is, visit these factories and actually inspect them. But these factory certificates were coming up for renewal. Buyers were asking, you know, how do we continue doing our due diligence? And so we had to come up with practical solutions for that. And what we did was develop what we call an alternative desktop assessment. And it's this whole idea of remote auditing and how can we leverage it with some very defined parameters. And I want to be very clear about this, right? I think remote auditing is a buzzword these days and has taken on a lot of attention and interest. And there is good potential there to some extent. But in the social compliance space, when we said we can accept some kind of remote auditing, we said, look, it has to be at a factory that we've already visited before, right? Because conceptually, to me, to be able to validate a factory as a socially responsible manufacturer, you cannot make that decision for a first-time factory that you've never been before without actually visiting that factory. Because truly, it's about the working conditions. It's about seeing the workers there. And you have to walk through a factory to get a real sense of it. You cannot, you know, someone will tell you, well, we can take a laptop or an iPad and walk around and show you what's there to see. That's not going to cut it. You're not going to be able to smell volatile organic compounds that way, for example, right? You're not going to be able to get a sense of the general buzz, a sense of how many of those workers are trying to catch your eye or trying to avoid it instead. You know, you're not going to get any of those things just with a camera walking you around. So we made the decision up front that it's not going to be possible to use remote audits as the solution for first-time factories. We're just going to have to wait there. But the vast majority of factories in any program are returning factories. And in those cases, we've been there before. We've established a baseline. We know that the physical space is adequate, and we have a overall sense of the vibe there, for want of a better way of putting it. In those cases, we said, sure, we can do a remote assessment that will involve a certain number of document reviews, payroll, some interviews with management. Because the other thing, again, is remotely, you cannot truly remotely interview workers in a way that will make them comfortable or you confident that you are getting an open and honest dialogue. You don't know who's behind the camera. You don't know who's monitoring the internet. You can't give the confidentiality promise that you have to in order to do your job right. So we are limited by those realities when it comes to what remote audits can do. But for factories that have a history with us already, we said we'll do a remote assessment, and if all is well, we will give you an extension of your certificate. It's not enough to justify a whole new certificate for reasons I've discussed, but we'll extend the certificate, which we did by 4 months for all these factories, which then brought us into now the end of the third quarter, where thankfully most factories are now once again at a place where we can visit them. So it was, in our minds, a practical and hopefully a valuable to the factories way to bridge this gap. Going forward, we do see great value in some remote elements enhancing our audits, right? We've got a great working group that I'm fostering with our peer groups to dive into this issue of worker voice platforms and remote ways of gathering that data to then make audits that much more targeted, that much more effective. You go in with a better sense of what's happening and you can devise specific avenues of inquiry. So there is great value and great potential for remote platforms in enhancing social audits, but they will never replace the traditional social audit in its entirety. Maybe we can get to where you don't have to visit a factory every year. Now we can do visits and then remote for the next cycle before another visit. That might be one future scenario. But again, for a first-time factory, I cannot envision anything other than that traditional audit as the foundation to begin the assessment process before we can then enhance it with various remote platforms.
Right. Yeah, no, really interesting your point about walking through a factory. You can't smell something through an app. But I find it's a fascinating time right now because technology and innovation is driving so much change in this industry. So I do believe that there will be an evolution of some of the technologies and these apps that are available now. Hopefully will help to strengthen, and there'll be some sort of, like you said, a hybrid model of both in-person and remote. So. All right, well, that's the end of our question period. I wonder if you have any sort of final thoughts or comments or something to leave our audience with, a burning, question or something that they can really take away from.
Well, first and foremost, my gratitude. I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you, Kelly, for the good work you do. And thank you to all the folks who stayed on through this presentation and have been involved all day long. I know it's been a long one, and I appreciate that. As far as the fundamental message I'm trying to share here goes, it's what I began my remarks with. This crisis has been truly and continues to be a gut-wrenching one and has caused much consternation. I don't want to belittle that in any way, but it is important to try to make the most of it, even as we suffer through it and still are suffering through it. And the one thing we can do is learn from the lessons of the experience and the realities of the failures of the old ways of thinking that it has exposed. And this is a great opportunity as we recognize in our daily lives, right, that we're not going to go back to the old way of doing things. You hear all this talk of the new normal. I don't think it's here yet. None of this is normal, right? But whatever that new normal ends up being, it's not going to be the old normal. This is the time then to take advantage of this opportunity and rethink and as you've said, the theme for this session, this seminar, build back better. Come back with the fundamental structural changes that the industry needs. And one area where that can be done and can be done quickly, efficiently, is in how supply chain social compliance management is handled. And that new paradigm that we're proposing is synchronization.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today. I will be sending a link to the recording, and along with that, I will also send the presentation on synchronization that Avidus had mentioned before. So thank you again, everybody, for joining. Thank you to Avidus and to RAP for your support of the series. And we'll see, hopefully, all of you tomorrow.
Thank you, Kelly.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.